This will become relevant. Okay. Do I need to press anything, or can you hear me loud and clear?
Hear you loud and clear. You're good to go.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Tinette DeVoe. I'm with the Sierra Club Canada Foundation, representing the Atlantic chapter. And I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So if we could have the first slide, please. I'm speaking today from Chibuktuk, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and I would like to call attention to the fact that while we speak about the invasion of Ukraine, for example, and reflect on how horrible that is, we frequently forget that the territory that we reside on today was taken, but it has not been ceded. Next slide. All right, so let's set some context for this rate increase that's been requested by Nova Scotia Power, the 11.6% rate increase. We know that last year, Nova Scotia Power reported record profits of $241 million. Next slide, please. Nova Scotia Power's parent company, Emera, reported profits of $723 million. Next slide. Emera's president, Scott Balfour, pulled in $8.28 million in combined salary and stock options for his service in 2021. We also know that Nova Scotia Power executives receive sizable paychecks and are requesting a raise, which of course will all impact our power rates. Next slide, please. Now, the executives at Nova Scotia Power and Emera are well aware that wind and solar power are much more affordable than electricity generated by coal, oil, petcoke, or natural gas, which is more accurately referred to as fossil gas or fracked gas. As you can see in this slide, the cost is considerable. What's not depicted here is the fact that battery storage, the cost of that has come down 43% in the past 5 years. Now, despite its mandate to provide the most affordable fuel options to customers, the utility has resisted the transition to affordable, clean, renewable energy. As a result, Nova Scotians remain dependent on expensive and dirty fossil fuels. In addition, NSPI has indicated that it's unlikely to meet its 40% renewable energy requirements by the end of this year. That was in its 10-year systems outlook, which it submitted in July, I believe. And that deadline, the end of this year, was an extended deadline that the provincial government gave Nova Scotia Power because it was unable to meet the original 2020 deadline. Nova Scotia Power makes more money generating the province's electricity with dirty fossil fuels and large infrastructure projects than it would using clean energy with its current business as usual model. So we have a basic conflict of interest here. In order to bring down the cost of electricity for ratepayers, Nova Scotia Power must support rather than impede wind and solar projects in this province. However, in order to make as much profit as possible, NSPI needs to prolong the transition away from fossil fuels and wherever possible, drag Nova Scotia into costly, decade-long infrastructure projects that allow the company to earn sizable guaranteed rates of return. So this makes building another maritime link or a fossil gas plant very attractive. And of course, the multi-billion-dollar Atlantic Loop. We're going to talk next about, I'm going to break it down a little bit here and talk about making money on the fuel cost recovery. So Nova Scotia Power isn't allowed to mark up the cost of the fuel it buys to power its generating stations. If it buys coal or oil for X amount, it is required to pass along that cost to customers at the same price. This is known as the flow-through cost of fuel. Now, in order to make any money off this transaction, NSPI has to underestimate the cost of fuels that it presents in its application to the Utility and Review Board. When Nova Scotia Power underestimates the cost of the fuel, this under-recovered amount becomes a kind of payday loan. Nova Scotia Power is the lender and customers are the borrowers. Though most Nova Scotians actually have no idea that they've entered into a kind of payday loan with their utility company. At the end of January, Nova Scotia Power submitted its general rate application to the UARB based on forecasted fuel costs from May of 2021. Even though the price for coal and oil had skyrocketed in the subsequent 8 months leading up to its submission. Last week, NSPI reported that its actual fuel costs were $681 million higher than what it had recovered. So why does that matter? Well, it means customers are not only on the hook for $681 million, but also for an additional 8% interest that NSPI charges for under-recovered fuel costs. The longer it takes for NSPI to recover those fuel costs, the more profit it makes financing them. Next slide, please. So to put this in terms that maybe everyday consumers can understand, if you gas up at the pump every week for a year at the price of 1.5 cents per liter, and then at the end of the year, you get a bill, next slide, please, that says, actually, so sorry, the real cost was $3 a liter, so from $1.5 a liter to $3 a liter, and you have to pay back that additional $1.5 a liter for each time, you know, for all of the fuel you used, plus interest. It's pretty sweet. Now, while Nova Scotia Power appears to be generously offering to defer recovering fuel costs for another few years, you know, pushing it down the road, it's actually setting itself up to make more money because it can charge above market interest rates on the amount we customers owe. Again, It's a kind of costly payday loan. And it just so happens that NSPI has asked the UARB to allow it to defer recovery for higher fuel costs in 2023 and 2024 to at least 2025. It's important to point out that the payday model doesn't work for wind and solar. Once solar arrays and wind turbines are installed, there's no fluctuating fee for wind or solar arrays. So NSPI can't under-recover wind and sunshine and then turn around and charge above market interest rates to finance them. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the guaranteed rate of return. Nova Scotia Power is requesting an increase in the guaranteed rate of return from 9.25% to 9.5%. That's a pretty sweet guaranteed rate of return, whether it's 9.25% or 9.5%. I don't know where else you go to get that kind of guaranteed rate of return, quite honestly. If I knew, I'd be invested in it. The utility is also requesting an increase to increase its equity thickness. Next slide, please. So the guaranteed rate of return applies to the equity thickness, and it wants to increase its equity thickness. So what the heck is equity thickness? Next slide, please. So Nova Scotia Power is requesting an increase from 37.5% to 45% equity thickness, which this guaranteed rate would apply to. So let's say Nova Scotia Power decides it wants to build a big infrastructure project like the Maritime Link. It's able to earn a guaranteed rate of return on its capital investment in the project based on the equity thickness, even if power never flows through the link, or if it's significantly reduced or delayed, as is the case today with hydro from Muskrat Falls. And in fact, we've already begun paying for that link. So Nova Scotia Powers are directly impacted by the following formula. Big infrastructure plus big capital investment plus increased equity thickness equals a big rate of return for Nova Scotia Power. For Nova Scotians, this means expensive and ever-increasing power rates. It also means, next slide please, that there's very little incentive for Nova Scotia Power to support more affordable distributed energy sources, such as wind and solar, or less costly energy infrastructure projects. There simply isn't as much profit in renewable energy as there is for Nova Scotia Power to build a new fossil gas plant or another maritime link. Nova Scotia Power also collects guaranteed rate of returns on its capital assets, which include its aging power fleet, which are quickly becoming stranded assets. However, stranded or not, Nova Scotia Power customers are expected to pay for them. Next slide, please. So the decarbonization deferral account. The name of this new fee, new proposed fee, makes it sound like Nova Scotia Power plans to build a bunch of wind and solar farms and hand over the bill later. But in fact, these are depreciation costs for Nova Scotia Power's stranded assets, which the company intends to pass along to customers. This includes the cost of retiring its coal-fired plants. In January, Nova Scotia Power estimated the cost of writing off coal plants would be $370 million. This is money that Nova Scotians are expected to pay to Nova Scotia Power over and above the 11.6 general rate increase. Next slide, please. Storm Rider. Nova Scotia Power wants to charge customers extra fees for repairs following big storms, or the cost of having its crews on the ready throughout the province because of a forecasted storm. Again, this fee would be over and above the general rate increase that Nova Scotia Power has applied for. Nova Scotia Power acknowledges that we're seeing more intense storms and extreme weather events as a result of climate change. As we know, climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. What people may not know is that Nova Scotia Power is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the province. Now, perhaps Nova Scotia Power could be forgiven if it was genuinely trying to get off fossil fuels. But sadly, it has delayed and roadblocked the transition to clean renewable energy for years. Any wind and solar that we have today has come in spite of Nova Scotia Power, not because of it. Next slide, please. I'm going to make a mention first about cap and trade, and then I'm going to proceed with our asks. Under Nova Scotia's cap and trade program, which expires at the end of this year, Nova Scotia Power is required to pay greenhouse gas emissions that are over and above its allowable GHG credits. This is yet another cost that Nova Scotia Power passes along to customers through our power rates. Last week, the provincial government stepped in to offer Nova Scotia Power $165 million to offset its greenhouse gas emissions tab. So instead of the greenhouse gas costs appearing in our electricity rates, they will come out of the taxes that all Nova Scotians pay. Meanwhile, Nova Scotia Power gets to keep its record-breaking profits. Going forward, Nova Scotia Power will be subject to a federal carbon tax that will increase annually. The federal carbon tax is designed to encourage a transition to clean renewable energy and make polluters pay. Nova Scotia Power has chosen to remain primarily a polluter. The company's decision is a costly one for customers and for Nova Scotia taxpayers, whether it's a cap and trade cost or a carbon tax. So what can the UARB do to support Nova Scotians? First of all, it can reduce Nova Scotia Power's guaranteed rate of return. We should not be talking about whether to increase it. We should be asking how much should it be reduced. Next slide. Secondly, the UARB can reduce Nova Scotia Power's equity thickness and allow the Nova Scotia government to build new infrastructure at cost and pass those savings along to customers. The millions in savings can help subsidize deep energy retrofits and energy efficiency programs particularly for those who are struggling with energy poverty. Next. The UARB can allow the Nova Scotia government or banks to finance under-recovered fuel costs in order to create a flow-through mechanism for fuel financing and not just for fuel costs. In essence, this means closing down Nova Scotia Power's payday loans and banking at the credit union instead. Next slide. The UARB can require Nova Scotia Power to absorb all cap and trade fees or carbon tax costs from its annual profits. There's no reason why the people of this province should be paying for Nova Scotia Power to continue dragging its heels on the transition to clean, renewable energy. Next. The UARB can say no to the decarbonization deferral account, thereby rejecting Nova Scotia Power's request to make customers pay for the company's stranded assets. Next. The UARB can reject Nova Scotia Power's proposed storm rider. Frankly, it's insulting considering the predicament that Nova Scotia Power has put the people of this province in. Next. The UARB can require Nova Scotia Power to meet its 40% clean renewable energy benchmark before appearing before the UARB to request a general rate hike. Next. And finally, the UARB can require Nova Scotia Power executives to get training on distributed, clean, renewable energy systems. They appear to still be in the dark about the future of energy, and they risk bringing Nova Scotians down with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. DeVoe. We'll mark your presentation as well as an exhibit. I believe that will be N125. And I'd like to thank you for taking your time to prepare your submissions and to come out this evening to present them to us.
Okay. I hope we don't have to put too much more money in this piggy bank for Nova Scotia Power.